Thank you so much for joining us. We know you have options at the conference, and it's fantastic that the systems case method with you today. My name is Cynthia Rayner. I am dialing in from Cape Town, South Africa. I am associated with the Bertha Center for Social Innovation at the University of Cape Town Graduate School of Business. And I'm joined by several of my colleagues, some from the Graduate School of Business and some from other institutions. And it is my pleasure to start by introducing them before we dive into the systems case method and what that is all about. So I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint presentation. I promise you we won't do death by PowerPoint. It's going to be about 10 minutes. But we thought this would be a good way to just get the ball rolling. So we have 4 panelists that are joining us today. And like I said, some of them are colleagues with me here at the GSB, and then others are from other parts of both South Africa and around the world. And the first on the left here is Claire Barnardo. And I'm just going to read the bios because I want to make sure you see kind of what a nice breadth of experience we have here. Claire Barnardo has started and she manages the Case Writing Center at the Graduate School of Business at UCT, the University of Cape Town. And the Case Writing Center is now in its 4th year. And really this has been a pioneering institution within the business school because we are pioneering the writing and the publication of African-focused teaching cases. And the Case Writing Center was actually established with funding from the Harvard Business School Alumni Africa Club. And it now hosts a collection of 50 teaching cases, many of them award-winning, and they are relevant to doing business in emerging markets. And what I love about working with Claire is that she truly is passionate about writing and championing local business cases. I'm also joined by Phumlani Nkontwana, and he is joining us from Stellenbosch University, where he is regular faculty, and he is also visiting faculty at the UCT GSB. He's a PhD candidate at Stellenbosch, and he is studying innovation hubs, which is partly why he's joining us today. And next to that, he runs Fuata Africa, and that is a consulting firm that helps governments and international development organizations with entrepreneurship research. I'm also joined by Ncedisa Nkonyeni. I work closely with Ncedisa at the social systems portfolio at the Bertha Center for Social Innovation, and she leads this portfolio at the Bertha Center. She's also a co-convener of the Social Entrepreneurship and Systems Change Executive Education course, which is one of the courses that we deliver at the Bertha Center. And she writes here, and this is true, she is deeply curious about what happens at the intersection of social justice and systems thinking. And that is really what we are going to be talking about today in the context of case writing and case teaching. Gayle Northrop is our final panelist, and Gayle joins us from the other side of the world. She's an educator, consultant, and coach, and she's also president of Northrop Nonprofit Consulting, and she's a lecturer at UCLA Anderson School of Management. And we have had an enormous amount of fun and excitement and just engagement with Gayle in developing these systems cases, particularly for her courses on social entrepreneurship and systems change. She's also a senior advisor for the Bertha Center, and she has worked closely with us for many years. So these are my panelists, and I hope that you will agree that this is a great set of people to talk to us about the topic at hand, which is the systems case method. And I'd like to just start by talking about what is this that we are discussing today. So I'd like to start just by showing a series of images, and oftentimes images can say more than words. And we'd like to walk through these 3 stories, the first one that I'm showing you here. And the reason why we are showing these images of these stories is because these are some of the cases that we have been writing over the last 2 years. This first set of, did I lose him? No, okay. Sorry about that. This first set of images is a set of images from Fees Must Fall, which was a social movement that started in 2015. Many of you have been aware of a global movement called Rhodes Must Fall, which was the toppling of the statue of Cecil Rhodes at the University of Cape Town. This was kind of an inciting incident, but actually the broader movement came about a year later when a large group of students over the course of several institutions began to make movement for lowering the fees for higher education. This was a movement that involved many different actors. It started with students, but then it spread to outsourced workers at the institutions who were demanding that they be insourced into the institutions. Of course, this also spread to the administrations who were trying to react to the movement and trying to decide how to maneuver in this environment. And then it was also the faculty as well as alumni who became involved in the movement. In addition to that, we were involved tangentially to the movement, sitting at kind of a remote campus at the Graduate School of Business. But quickly we realized that we weren't remote, that we wanted to become part of this movement. And so we decided to try and write up a case that was talking about how this movement felt from the perspective of a few different actors. And what we realized was that by trying to tell this story from just a single protagonist, we would be missing a lot of the story. So that's my first set of images. Now I want to move on to another set of images. This is a global story. This is a global story about financial literacy for children all over the world. And you can see here that there are a couple of different images, some that are happening in the classroom, others that are happening on the street, and then some that are happening on a high street next to a bank. And what these images are trying to portray is that financial literacy isn't just about children and parents or even about education institutions, but also about a number of different actors who come into play about whether or not children are educated from a financial standpoint. So this was another case that we were trying to write. And in fact, we wrote it from a single standpoint, but we felt that it was insufficient. We felt concerned that by telling the story only from a single organization, we were missing something. We were missing significant parts of the story. And now I'm going to show you the third set of images, and these are a set of images about early childhood education. And this is the most recent case that we have been working on. And this is a case about a social impact bond that was launched in Cape Town just a couple of years ago, but which actually was in development for many years. And this also involved many different actors. It involved children and caregivers, as well as people from the Department of Education and the Department of Health and the Department of Social Development. But there was a new set of actors that wanted to have a part to play in the early childhood education of children in the Western Cape. And these were investors, private investors, and they wanted to play a part in financing the venture capital for these early childhood interventions. But of course, that brought with it a whole set of questions and complexities that had not been introduced into early childhood education before. And again, we were struggling with the fact that if we told this story from just a single protagonist, we would run into kind of a simplification of the story when in fact it was truly a complex story. So why do I tell you all of these stories? What I think we're running into, and what actually Phumlani has been helpful in helping us to think about, is that in trying to teach cases from a single point of view, we were operating in the realm of kind of complicated and obvious problems. And this is a framework called the Cynefin framework by David Snowden. And what he says is that problems actually operate in 4 different domains. And if you're over in these complicated and obvious domains, then you can tell the stories from a single point of view, because the problem solving of these stories or of these issues is straightforward. And you can operate in that realm of good practice and best practice, where many of our cases up until now have situated themselves. But in fact, many of the stories that we were trying to understand and explore were in the complex and chaotic environments in these domains. And so by trying to tell these stories from just a single point of view, we were missing quite a bit of the complexity in these stories. And so we started to think about, well, how can we actually teach in social systems without understanding and making known the complexity of these issues? And so we started to think about how could we create new types of cases that would allow us to operate in the complex and chaotic realm, even in a classroom. So these were the questions that really started to come home to us. We said, how can we embrace rather than diminish complexity in the classroom? We started to look at some of the cases that we were teaching and they felt too simplistic. We wanted to actually move into complexity in the classroom rather than trying to diminish it. How could we integrate the work of multiple actors, bringing in the work of other organizations and other institutions? And then even more importantly, and this was a question that came to us over the course of the development of this method, is how can we instill empathy with many perspectives so that a student coming into a room isn't taught to just sit themselves within a single perspective, but actually have empathy and be able to stand in the shoes of other protagonists, many protagonists to a specific social issue. So we started to develop what we called our systems case manifesto, which is a bit of a dramatic term, but we were feeling dramatic at the time. And these were the things that we have highlighted in our development of cases. We really want to privilege questions over answers. So these aren't cases that we try to crack or try to solve, but rather we're really trying to ensure that all voices are heard equally and that there are power dynamics that need to be unveiled in every system, and that we can't not bring those into the classroom, that in fact the classroom is the place to bring those up in. And that we want to put participants in our classrooms into the shoes of multiple protagonists so that they can experience that sense of empathy and practice that sense of empathy in a safe space, that they can sit in multiple points of views rather than try to walk in with just a single perspective. And then in the classroom, we can explore that web of relationships and see how a story can unfold from different points of view. And again, because we're not privileged, we're not trying to get to single answers, we're actually looking for a plurality of approaches, which, as we know from system science, is really the best approach when you're in a complex domain. So traditional cases versus systems cases, this is a bit of a simple chart, but the idea is that in a traditional case, usually you're telling the story from a single protagonist, but in a systems case, you're actually trying to tell the story from multiple perspectives and you have multiple protagonists. And I'll show you a little bit about how we do that. Traditional cases, they tackle complicated problems, so you're driving towards a solution, and systems cases are able to operate in complex and chaotic environments with issues that require multiple decisions and multiple ways of being. And then this last one is interesting to me, and I'm still kind of toying with this, but how can you encourage, rather than problem solving and decision making, but rather in a classroom, encourage sense making? So the idea is not to drive towards a solution, but to experience a way of being in the system so that you can come out of it looking at the world in a new way. Lastly, I just want to show you what it looks like. So we've written 3 of these cases now, and this is the second case that I told you about, the one that is written about financial literacy for children. You can see here that the cases are shorter. They generally are about 4 to 8 pages rather than 30 pages. They generally have what we call a background note. So you can see in the left-hand corner there, that's the first page. It sets the scene. It's about financial education for children. And then each protagonist has a 1 or 2 page vignette where we write from their point of view, how does this issue look and how does the story unfold for them? And then at the end of the case, we set up a postscript that can be released in the class, where after all of the different participants have had a chance to sit in the shoes of different protagonists, they get to see how it actually unfolded in real life. So this is the example of one of our cases. We've got 2 cases that we've written like this, and we're working on that innovation impact bond case right now. So these are the three cases that I've told you about. And now I want to stop being the one talking, and I want to open it up to our panel. And we're going to spend about 20 to 30 minutes talking in a panel, and then we would like to open it up to Q&A to the group. This is experimental, so this is our first chance to be able to talk to a larger group about what we're trying to do, and all of your feedback and critique is very welcome. So let me stop sharing the slides here and let me open it up to our panel. And I'm going to go ahead and direct the first question to Ncedisa, because really it is partly the pain points that we were experiencing in the classroom that drove us to start to develop this method. So Ncedisa, can you tell us a little bit about those pain points? What were the things that you were experiencing in the classroom that made us start to think about this method? Oh, yeah.
What would be a Zoom conference without someone realizing they're not muted? Thanks, Cynthia. So yeah, that's that question around, the pain points, and in the narrative, in the spirit of narrative. I'm also going to tell a story, and as well as the pain point, it's about the enabling conditions that really intersected with the development of the systems teaching case method. And as a center, we'd been delivering systems change and social impact course, right, for probably about 3 to 4 rounds. And we were sat down at a table as the core delivery team to design the latest iteration, the next iteration for the year. And we were reflecting on what had worked and not worked the year before. And it was in this conversation that we found ourselves talking about the frustration we had seen in the class when we tried to teach specifically systems mapping. And we'd seen this frustration in previous cohorts when trying to teach systems mapping. Now, systems mapping, it's kind of that crossover tool that attracts people to systems thinking, I think, and it carries with it this impossible promise that if you draw a perfect systems map, that map will help you identify leverage points that will then help you transform your system. But as we were teaching this tool, people weren't experiencing into the promise of mastery as such, right? And from one year to the next, we noticed this and we try something different. We keep trying to teach this tool. We tried different facilitators, we tried different systems mapping approaches, and we kept seeing the same thing. And I think that's partly because of that thing that I said earlier, which was right, that it's this tool, it's this crossover tool that draws people to systems thinking. So we were like, maybe we're not doing something right? And yeah, maybe it's our delivery that's making this thing arise that we keep noticing. And what this thing was deepening frustration. As participants realized that what they were drawing when they were now actually trying out the tool, that what they were drawing was not the silver bullet as such, but something that was showing them just how complex and manageable and messy their systems were. And this wasn't leaving people feeling empowered at the end of the session. In fact, it was leaving people painfully aware about their powerlessness, which is an occupational hazard, I think, of teaching complexity in systems thinking. And it's also not a good place to leave anyone for too long. Yeah, so that's kind of some of that's kind of what was happening in the background, And on this day, on this day that we were sat there, like, looking to reconfigure the course and talking about this frustration, instead of managing the frustration in the way that we had in the past, we reflected on the powerlessness that we spent more time reflecting on the powerlessness that we'd seen. And we also self-identified into our own powerlessness around getting students past that point of paralysis, right? And we asked ourselves what would happen if we embraced our own frustration instead of trying to manage it, and started to recognize the frustration to be the exact affect, not exact, but of a qualitatively similar affect that arises when you try to navigate complex systems and they don't fall in, right? When you get to that point where the temptation is to give up, to force something, to manage it, just as we had done by trying different facilitators and different approaches, when actually perhaps the best way forward is to stay together in the journey. And this is what we started talking about. It was a very long design session and it was very reflective and conversational. But we got to a point where we said, staying together in the systems work is the key, right? Recognizing that one individual or one way can't strengthen a system's transformative capacity per se, but what can unlock that transformative capacity is different members of the systems applying the frameworks and their resources in collaboration with each other. And this is what we realized. We realized that this is what our teaching needed to bring. We realized that we'd been trying to output systems thinkers, right? We'd been kind of going into the area of systems thinking to a certain extent, systems teaching, assuming the classroom to be a complicated setup, forgetting that it's actually deeply complex as well. So we've been trying to output systems thinkers where what our program needed to bring is, what it needed to be doing is to be building up systems transformative capacity. A system's ability to regenerate rather than to extract, and a system's ability to almost heal itself. And so we basically concluded that design session by giving ourselves permission to explore what might happen if we worked with the frustration as intelligence rather than try to manage it out of the picture. Another way of saying is that we gave ourselves the permission to embrace complexity in how we were trying to teach systems work. And that being the outcome of that very long design session. And quite soon thereafter, we spoke to Phumlani, who was a guest facilitator on the course, and we told him about our frustration and our attempt to work it into, or our curiosity around how to work it into the learning outcomes. And he was a little further in his thinking around what is needed to teach systems work. And he related to the cognitive dissonance that we were speaking of teaching systems frameworks as competencies that will manage complexity. And he started to reflect on the neglected sensibilities that when you apply them with the frameworks, the competencies, could potentially start to shift the needle, right? And we started talking about empathy and the role of empathy in systems work, which is one that is multifaceted, but it also includes what makes us want to transform our systems. It's empathy that makes us want to transform our systems. It's not the only thing, but that's a role that it can play. It's empathy that makes us understand parts of the systems for which we have no life experience. And it's empathy that helps us stay together when we've been working at the system and the system weren't falling. So, we started to talk about the sensibilities that when we put them together with the concepts, the competencies of systems frameworks, could deepen the system's transformative capacity, and started to bring in language with pain points, vulnerability, and empathy into our actual curriculum, right? And that really, I'm talking about the systems change course, right? But in talking about it, I also said I was going to tell the story of the enabling conditions for the development of the systems teaching case method, right? Our pain point was the frustration. Inside the frustration was the invitation for us to embrace complexity. In doing that, we started to better understand the why of systems teaching. And with that came the openness to develop curriculum that embraced complexity in the same way. And it was probably a few weeks later that we were brainstorming with Cynthia, and she was talking about experimenting with cases that approach the narratives from multiple perspectives. And this dovetailed beautifully with where the course and the program was. And and it became a no-brainer that the course would be the natural incubator for such cases to begin anyway. And today, here we are. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Ncedisa. I think what's important to realize is that, you know, we had people in the room that were coming from all of these different disciplines, and the ability to actually draw upon the experience in the room was also very important. I was thinking about that as you were speaking. So many times you're teaching a session, and in particular with these cases, you're able to draw upon the different life experiences of those in the room. And by doing that, you actually validate and affirm that there are multiple perspectives to every story. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to take the conversation a little bit broader now by turning to Claire and thinking a little bit about these systems cases, not just for teaching topics of social change and social justice and social entrepreneurship, but also thinking about why might these types of cases be truly important for this time in the world, even for disciplines outside of social impact. So Claire, tell me, what are your thoughts about that as someone who is looking at kind of a whole breadth of cases across the GSB? What do you think about that idea?
Thanks, Cynthia. And well, I've just come out of our ethics track, so I've been giving it a lot of thought in terms of that. And I think for me, what really stands out is that this is embracing, you know, multiple viewpoints and multiple protagonists. So you have the ability to step into more than one pair of shoes. And just coming out of that ethics track, I could see how this could really be used across, you know, a lot of other areas, ethics being one. And I think what's interesting for us is that, well, we're actually quite used to functioning in very complex systems and society. And I think developing this also felt quite natural and a next kind of step in terms of, okay, we need a tool that will work in what we're doing. And so I think this is a step in doing that. Just looking at the context of this last year, I'm sure at this conference, everyone is kind of rethinking ways in which to approach things. And I think that this systems case format could really be used in a lot of ways, in many subjects, not only in the traditional business subjects, but I think as we're faced with more and more complexities globally, we need to value more and more viewpoints around things. And so this really excites me in terms of us trying to do that and bringing a new format to case teaching.
Claire, do you think, I'm just going to ask a follow-on question here. Do you think that it is that the systems case method has a unique role to play in an emerging market like South Africa or in the global South more generally? Do you think that this method originating out of kind of our own complex environment is kind of a natural extension of what you've seen other case writers and faculty in the University of Cape Town, for example, trying to grapple with?
Absolutely. I mean, I think also we're moving towards creating also really good short cases and being able to bring in an entire story with a whole, you know, a whole tapestry, a collection of protagonists. I think definitely it's, you know, there's a reason that it's coming from our home.
Okay, great. Thank you, Claire. In that vein, I'm going to move on to Gayle and specifically ask Gayle if she thinks that there is possibility or interest in cases originating out of the Global South, perhaps in the systems case method, or in the systems case method more generally for Global North institutions? Why would this seem exciting to you in the work that you are doing?
Thanks, Cynthia. And it is exciting. And I also want to recognize
Let me unmute you, Gayle. Sorry about that.
Can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
I was going to say it is exciting. And I do also want to recognize that my comments are between now and Phumlani speaking, and he has got so much to share. I'm going to try and be quite brief and just share my enthusiasm. I think this is an amazing, and it may not seem as game-changing on the surface. Hopefully people get that sense. But it really is to me. I teach in a business school in North America. I'm used to teaching both MBA students and undergraduate students using the typical cases. I don't use them in the typical ways usually. I usually use them to tell a story versus kind of setting up a problem and using the protagonist approach. But as you've all mentioned, the fact that we've got multiple protagonists and we're pulling out the reality of the complexity of issues facing society, whether they're business, environmental, or social, and actually aligning a teaching methodology with that complexity it really is game changing because we have consistently been teaching, with a few exceptions, with a very static approach to problem solving, to single protagonist, and frankly to people who look a certain way who are trying to solve society's problems. So to have the ability, I think in this case, and I think particularly about entrepreneurship, I'm in the entrepreneurship space, whether it's for-profit, nonprofit, and it's about problem solving, but how can that occur without this deep grounding in, as Ncedisa and others have said, empathy, without understanding the multiple diverse viewpoints that are affecting a situation or related to a problem. So I think the issues of, the manifesto touching on issues of empathy, humility, listening deeply, and really building those muscles among our students, that to me is great. But to say it is one thing, to actually have a case that illustrates it is really quite exciting. So that's what I'm excited about. I also think it's notable that, as Claire said, it's coming, this is originating in the Global South, but I don't feel at all, I think it therefore works well in teaching classes with a global focus, but I don't think it's unique. And I think any institution in globally, but certainly in North America and Global North, can use this type of methodology. And it really takes global ideas and makes them local, because you're sitting in the shoes of individual protagonists that makes the issues very real. And that even includes fees must fall, which my students don't know what fees must fall is. I'll be honest with you. That's not something that they're familiar with. And the vignette at the front that describes it gives them exactly the context they need to then begin to put them in the shoes of the various players that will grapple with the issue. I love that it's short. I love that it's shorter. These long cases, I have a lot of material I want my students to read, and complementary material to a case. So to have a case that isn't 13 pages plus 10 exhibits with all kinds of financials, which frankly, in my classes, we don't always get into, is really exciting. So I'm just very practically, I'm using the case itself, the cases themselves in my social entrepreneurship class. It's just a standard social entrepreneurship class. And I'm using it because I teach a lecture on systems change. So it's perfect. I can give them a case that's not only the child and youth finance case, that's not only about changing a system of financial and education, but I'm actually able then to show them a whole different way of thinking by having this case demonstrate complexity, multiple viewpoints, multiple protagonists. So I'm using it in that case. I use them in my social entrepreneurship in South Africa class. That's pretty obvious. And then, as you mentioned, I'm creating a new class on systems change, where I'm going to use all the cases because they do provide that combination of both the topic itself that gets into different ways of thinking, looking at parts and looking at the whole of a system instead of parts, moving from silos, looking at emergence, those kinds of concepts, but it is actually living it through the case. But I'm actually most excited about people, hopefully in this forum or in others, considering how can it be used for a marketing class? How can the systems case be used for a finance class? This isn't, to me, about specifically teaching systems change. It's actually about a new way of educating our students that illustrates multiple viewpoints and emphasizes skills around empathy and humility.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gayle. That's extremely helpful just to even think about it in a very practical context. Okay, I'm going to direct my last question to Phumlani. And Phumlani, I'd like you to just explain a little bit more about this idea of teaching complicated versus complex issues and about the problem solving versus the way of being. What do you think are the implications for students, for classrooms, and even for educators when you try to move from this one set of domains that we're quite used to operating in to a new set of domains that might feel more uncomfortable, that don't lead to tidy conclusions at the end of a session? What are the ways that you try to do that, and how do systems cases help with that?
Yeah, thanks for that. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
Greetings everyone from Johannesburg. I think in the spirit of stories, it's important to provide a bit of context of my own journey with systems. I think I was inspired, Cynthia, when I visited India, I think a year or two back. We were already teaching this particular case, and we're already, I think, onto our second or third cohort at UCT with you and Ncedisa. And they mentioned this concept of a yatri, and this was in New Delhi, and I spent some time there with Development Alternatives, this group trying to do systems work in India, and I was quite lucky that they're in a city, but we flew to Varanasi, a rural village, and they were quite immersed there, and they had stakeholders there that were quite, if you like, quote, informal. But these informal stakeholders were quite immersed in their process. And this concept of a yatri means an unstructured journey. So, and that's something that stayed with my mind, and I immediately shared it with Cynthia as a way that we can anchor the case. If we pause that, and then I visited England, a very small town in the south of England called Totnes. And Totnes, there is Schumacher College, and they teach. It's not really a systems case per se, but whatever they teach, it's quite immersed. So students clean every day, and they're taught responsibility, and they're quite ecological. So the people circulate around who washes the dishes, and who does the gardening, and it's quite immersive. And then I was quite privileged 4 years ago to start a new systems degree at Stellenbosch University from scratch, an undergraduate degree for 4 years. And the idea was to immerse young people into ways of thinking, but also importantly, ways of being and doing. And I think that's the major difference between a complicated and a complex domain that we are in the global south. The key is that it's actually a privilege to teach people that can focus on problem solving and decision making. And often these are white collar students that you find in MBAs. And often these are middle or senior managers or even CEOs of organizations. And so obviously it makes sense there that those people can be taught decision making and problem solving because they have an environment and a company that they can implement that. But what we found, actually my observation with being part of this course at Beta Center for the last 4 years is that actually the participant is a practitioner. There may be a director or a CEO, but it most likely is a CEO of an NGO or an activist group, or maybe one corporate guy or two. But essentially, these were practitioners at heart. And while I had done even a course at Harvard on systems case and all of that, it was clear to me that it wasn't going to fit because these practitioners were not necessarily legitimate stakeholders to make decisions. And so this idea of legitimizing stakeholders in literature is quite interesting because it forces us as facilitators to start thinking outside delivering frameworks that are reductionist and simplistic, to start thinking about how do we empower our participants to actually map or even create these frameworks that are inclusive of other stakeholders. So it was, for me, quite interesting to think about that. And the key thing between problem solving and empathy is that empathy is about abduction. So you have to be immersed in a particular complex. You cannot, there's only so much as someone can teach you. So what that means on a Monday morning for facilitators is that they have to actually spend very little time in the classroom. So that was a very practical implication that we had to go out of the classroom to actually be in the context where students can talk, even ask questions on their own or engage with formal and informal stakeholders. And the reason that's important is because that's the only way you can grow empathy. You cannot teach it. You can only immerse someone into that context. And so that's a key thing. And the reason abduction is important is because you can only properly sense make with multiple stakeholders in our context. And that process of you engaging with formal and informal stakeholders means that you are being transformed. So there's this transformation that doesn't happen at cognitive level only, but also is a way of being and a way of doing. And because most of our practitioners, what was clear is that, like us, they were equally frustrated. They didn't know the main narrative. They just knew fees must fall or fees has fallen or whatever that was going on, but they didn't know on a Monday morning who must they talk to. There are 23 universities in the country, main universities. There's various aspects of government in the Department of Education. If you go to a university, who do you speak to? So in formalized settings, it's easy to have a structure. But in our context, what we find is that even identifying those stakeholders is a privilege, is something that is not obvious. And therefore, our focus in teaching was really about saying, let's first map out what is emerging narratives, and then sense make together what is actually happening. And then we would then organize from there. And we didn't know what we didn't know. You can only unpack and know the next steps as you do them. And so, and also what was interesting for us is that as facilitators, we didn't know. And it wasn't about this perfectly put together case, with neatly a list of answers and these nice questions that you find in classic case methods. We didn't know. So the whole shift and transformation even within us was about immersing ourselves in our practitioners' shoes, that we're saying, I'm affected this way by fees must fall in this sector. And this is what this means for me now. And we hadn't known that. There was no book that will give you that. And so it was this shift of thinking away from just literature or cognitive science to a way of being, and most importantly, a way of doing, was quite key. And you can obviously back that up in the literature as we shared with that Siphon framework. We've adapted also that Siphon framework to include other things that are more real in our context. So I'll pause there for now, and maybe we could chat on questions.
Thanks so much, Phumlani. I think you've really given the group a taste of what it feels like in the classroom, particularly when you're talking to a group that is so immersed in the context. And that's what we were experiencing, this experience of being in this room, not knowing what the answers were, and trying to find some pedagogical tools that were going to help us navigate better together. And that's really what the systems case is about. It's a pedagogical tool that allows the classroom to become the safe space or the playground, the place where you can step in those shoes, that you can get out of the classroom virtually, figuratively, and step into other people's shoes while you're still in the classroom, but experiencing a different set of realities. Okay, I'm going to pause there too, and it would be wonderful if we could use the last 10 minutes to open it up to not just Q&A, but responses, critique, interest, or pushback, because we certainly feel like this is an experiment that we are only really in the early stages of embarking upon.
Like, I've literally just come across a case the past couple weeks. You know, we're dealing with digital disruption, tech, or rather, it was InsurTech. And, you know, so we're seeing this increasingly where the answer in the case is watching the company deal with the rise of the ecosystem model and increased partnerships. So just speaking to your question about where does this kind of model find provenance, we're seeing we need more and more approaches that are going to embrace stakeholder viewpoint, even in purely commercial spaces. Although I think the other thing that the digital disruption is showing us, especially in South Africa, is that there is no purely commercial, right? So it's there's always a social impact element to it, and that line between social enterprise becomes very blurry. But I think this is very exciting from that perspective, and kind of just hearing what Phumlani had to say about, you know, legitimizing stakeholders. It's so important because you'll just get like a fleeting reference to them in ordinary cases. So to really develop that and have a method for that, that seems really exciting. So
great, thanks so much, Sarah. Yeah, we actually had a moment in our startup case session yesterday where we were talking about information systems and systems rollouts within companies, and how these sorts of rollouts do require an enormous amount of empathy into the different stakeholders that are taking on information systems within either a corporate environment or a larger environment. And so we were talking about how even in an IS case, this could be quite an interesting method. I'm just going to go over to the chat box.
And Cynthia, if you don't mind, if I could just jump in, I saw a comment there from Malay about facilitators' guides and instructors' manuals. And I would just say, as the one kind of testing the teaching of these cases as they're literally rolling out, even in some cases in draft form, I rely really heavily on the guidance that the team has given through having a teaching note. So just like a normal case, the team has developed teaching notes for these cases. And what I think is really interesting, because for me, this is uncomfortable. And one thing I would say is teaching in this new way as a faculty member puts me in a place of discomfort. I'm used to being both very deeply knowledgeable about the case, the topic, and what the answers are that I am driving my students to. That's kind of the typical way to approach these things. So I have to suspend my need to control the conversation, to make sure that they're pulling out the viewpoints. But there are some very specific things that have been put into some teaching notes for these that helped give me the confidence to teach it, even just how long to spend on what concepts and how to answer some of the questions. Because I don't think that's any different. I think for us as faculty to feel comfortable teaching a new case, we need some help and guidance. So that is, I think we have them for each of the cases so far, don't we, for all three cases? Yeah.
Yeah. Looking over in the chat box here, and in addition to guides and a little bit to your point, Gayle, about driving towards a framework, this doesn't mean that we're divorcing the case from theory. So Ncedisa, I would love for you to talk a little bit about how we're incorporating theory with the cases, particularly, for example, with the Fees Must Fall case. We had a very specific theoretical framework that we wanted to drive towards, but it was a sense-making theory, not a decision-making theory. So could you talk a little bit about that? I think that might be helpful.
No, that's exactly it. Thank you, Cynthia. So with the Fees Must Fall, the piece of theory that we felt that the case kind of exemplified and would really help us get taught in the class was a piece of, or a framework in systems thinking called the adaptive cycle. And as Cynthia said, it's it's a sense-making framework. So I mean, how we did it, if I may just speak around that for a little bit, is that we actually divvied up the roles. One of the facilitators, I spoke to the theory, and my colleague spoke to the facilitation of the discussions, right? She would just kind of throw provocations in there, and the teaching note was there as a guide in the sense that it kind of guided us as to this is the direction in which this is what we want to land in the theory piece, in the conversations and the discussions. These are the types of discussions that could take us there, right? So and it was quite, as Gayle has spoken, it was a little bit nerve-wracking because it was very emergent. It was very emergent, and but in terms of helping to land the frameworks, I think it did do that. But another thing that it did for us as facilitators is it gave us a very different entry point into teaching the frameworks that we'd been using previously as well. But certainly it is underpinned by wanting to kind of teach frameworks, as with any kind of teaching case kind of context. And the teaching note really does kind of give a wayfinder in terms of trying to do that.
Something to add there, and I see quite a lot of comments again about kind of guides, or this tension between theory and practice. And the truth is, actually, there's a lot of even theory that backs up this approach, even though it was quite emergent for all of us. But there's a lot of theory that backs it, and one of them is called radical incrementalism, and then the other one is abduction science. So the key thing is that actually more and more scholars and even other education experts have been worried about higher education only embracing or teaching what we call inductive or deductive science. So the whole classical case method is really a reductionist method that helps participants be inductive or deductive. So you have these variables you can see, or these issues, and there's a budget, and there's a team that you manage, and and so because of that you can deduce what needs to happen. But actually to move away from inductive or deductive science to abductive science, so that kind of theoretical framework. But the other thing that Cynthia and Ncedisa didn't mention is that while we wanted to teach theory, this wasn't a running away from that, but we wanted to privilege practical tools, and wanted to privilege implementation. So we would bring, for example, a framework like 3 Horizons that is very much rooted on complexity science and systems thinking, but is really about empowering someone on a Monday morning to then go implement. How do you knit together? Because what we found also with complexity science is that first time I read the literature personally a few years back, I was disheartened. I was discouraged. I left as if my hands were chopped. But reading more and more experimentations literature that privileges doing and realizing that you nudge the system has been really, really powerful, and a mindset shift and a radical shift for us teaching and for our students, to say to them, don't worry about the formal stakeholders, just do. Just what can you do now? Who can you talk to tomorrow? And that's really what radical incrementalism is all about.
Thanks so much, Phumlani. I'm just looking over in the chat box, and before we run out of time, what I would love to offer anyone who's interested is to please reach out to us if you would like to engage on the method, receive any of the materials or view them. We would love feedback, because for us this is really a chance to be able to understand better how these can be used in different environments. We've kind of been keeping them close to our chest, testing them, but we're ready to get some critique.
I might just add, there were some comments about the multi-stakeholder perspective, multiple protagonists, and I actually think there's a great opportunity in the social sector, nonprofit classes, anybody that's trying to understand the complexity of social change. This methodology, I think, is ideal for that. I see my students that can't make the connection between the philanthropist, a social entrepreneur, a nonprofit leader. So in that space, I think there's great potential, as well as I said before, and as Claire mentioned, kind of more broad classes. I can't imagine a place where you're not trying to help students understand multi-stakeholder perspectives and the power of empathy and sitting in different shoes in order to to see issues and to sense issues and to be within the system itself, as Phumlani says.
Wonderful. Well, I think that we've got one more minute if there's anything else. Otherwise, I know that people have other things to head off to. We just want to thank everyone for coming and staying with us. You always come into these with a fear that you'll just be speaking to one another, which we're happy to do, but it's so much more fun when we have others to engage with. So thank you, and thank you for all the comments. It's been great to just think through this with everyone.